Hey everyone, welcome back to Sip and Talk. And hey, thanks for sending in these sources for us to dig into.
Yeah, really interesting material.
We've got quite a collection here, all focused on, well, a pretty critical and, let's be honest, kind of tense time in recent global relations.
Absolutely. It's all about the effects of that America First approach.
Right.
Specifically, how it landed with U.S. allies, the long-standing ones, and what it all meant for the global economy, and, what it could mean if those policies came back.
Yeah, and the big question that seems to run through all this material you sent is, when a country pushes its own interests that hard, especially with things like tariffs, does it actually hit the intended targets, the perceived adversaries? Or does it end up, hurting its friends in the process?
That phrase you mentioned, hitting enemies, not friends.
Exactly. Was that what happened? Or did friends get caught in the crossfire?
It's a really central question, isn't it? And the sources definitely tackle it from different angles.
So our mission today, as always, is to dive deep into this stuff, pull out the key insights,
Understand the background, look at the impacts.
and check out the different viewpoints presented in your sources.
Let's do it.
All right, so first things first. How did the sources actually define America First in this context? What did it look like on the ground?
Well, at its core, the sources paint it as a really strong, sometimes pretty uncompromising focus on protecting the U.S. domestic economy.
American jobs, American industry,
Sure.
that kind of thing.
Exactly. It was framed as a shift sort of away from prioritizing, global cooperation or multilateral deals as the main goal.
And it wasn't just talk, right? The sources point to very specific actions, big ones.
Oh, yeah. Things like imposing tariffs on imports.
Steel and aluminum ones come up a lot.
Yes, those were major. Also, pulling out of big international trade agreements like the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
And then renegotiating existing deals, like NAFTA becoming the USMCA.
Right. And of course, launching that major trade dispute, specifically with China.
And your sources also stress that this isn't necessarily just a snapshot of the past, right? There's a sense that these dynamics could continue or even intensify.
That's a key point they make. If similar policies were brought back or strengthened, we might see round two, basically.
Something else the sources highlighted was the negotiation style. They described it as confident, maybe less concerned about market reactions.
Yeah, or even advisors' input, it seems. The goal described was pretty blunt. Get other countries to yield to what the U.S. wanted.
Definitely a change from, building consensus or working through coalitions.
A marked departure, yeah.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now, this is where it gets really interesting, where your sources spend a lot of time. How did all this actually affect U.S. allies?
Yes, the core issue.
The main theme coming through loud and clear is, real unease, friction, damage to trust.
Absolutely. Let's start with the trade stuff, those tariffs you mentioned. The sources really hammer this point. The 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum. They weren't just applied to rivals.
No, they hit allies, the EU, Canada, Mexico.
Exactly. And the justification given, according to the sources, national security, Section 232.
And that seems to be where the real tension flared up.
Right. Because telling Canada, or Germany, for instance, that their steel imports are a threat to U.S. national security, well, the sources say allies found that difficult to accept.
To put it mildly, I imagine, it kind of questions the whole foundation of the alliance, doesn't it?
It really does, and the reaction wasn't passive.
No, the sources mention the EU hitting back with retaliatory tariffs on things like American whiskey, motorcycles.
Yeah, specific goods chosen to, make a point politically and economically within the U.S. It showed these actions had consequences back home, too.
And the Canadian Prime Minister's reaction is singled out in the sources, calling it hard to take from a close friend.
Underscoring that feeling of, almost betrayal, maybe.
Yeah.
And the EU didn't just retaliate, they took it global. Filed a complaint with the WTO, the World Trade Organization.
Challenging the legality of it all under international trade rules.
So, yeah, these trade moves weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were symbolic blows, deep ones.
And it wasn't just the tariffs, was it? The sources link this to withdrawing from big multilateral agreements, too.
Definitely. Pulling out of the TPP, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. The sources say actions like that eroded trust even more.
Made allies question if the U.S. was still a reliable partner for the long haul.
Precisely. And you see the reaction, and the sources' allies didn't just sit there. They started looking elsewhere, making their own plans.
Like Japan pushing ahead with the CPTPP, the successor to the TPP.
Exactly. The sources cite that as a clear example, an explicit move to become less reliant on the U.S. market or U.S. leadership in that area.
So real, tangible shifts in strategy by allies.
Yes. And this spilled over into broader economic security, too. Things like U.S. sanctions having knock-on effects on global supply chains.
A Huawei example comes up.
Right. That put pressure on companies in allied nations like South Korea, Japan, places deeply tied into those global tech networks.
So actions aimed at one place, say China, ended up squeezing allied businesses too.
They got caught in the middle. And the potential long-term risk the sources flag is this idea of de-Americanization.
Meaning allies actively trying to become less dependent on the U.S.
Yeah, seeking self-sufficiency, diversifying their trade partners, finding other security arrangements maybe. Because of the unpredictability, over time, that could chip away at U.S. influence globally.
It paints a picture where trying to assert strength unilaterally might actually, paradoxically, weaken your global standing by pushing friends away.
That's definitely one of the central tensions the sources are wrestling with.
Okay, so we've got the diplomatic friction, the trust issues. Let's pivot to the economic side. Your sources suggest potentially serious costs, not just for allies, but maybe for the whole global economy.
Oh, absolutely. A big theme is the risk of global trade actually shrinking.
Makes sense. Tariff wars make trade more expensive, more complicated.
Right. It acts like a brake on the flow of goods and services worldwide.
And the sources put some numbers on this. I think the IMF estimate was mentioned.
Yes, the International Monetary Fund. They estimated the U.S.-China trade war, just that one conflict, shaved about 0.8% off global GDP growth.
Wow, 0.8%. It's not small.
Yeah.
It gives you a scale of the potential drag if these kinds of tensions spread.
It really does. And these costs, they're not just abstract figures. The sources point out that often the extra costs from tariffs or disrupted supply chains, it gets passed down.
To consumers.
Yeah.
So potentially higher prices in stores.
Potentially, yeah, in various countries, including the U.S. itself.
Beyond those direct trade costs, there's the whole issue of uncertainty, isn't there? The unpredictability.
Huge factor. Sudden tariff threats, questioning existing deals. It makes businesses really nervous about making big commitments.
So companies thinking about investing across borders, maybe setting up a factory or signing a long-term contract, they might just hold off.
Exactly. They might delay investing in the U.S. or even look for places perceived as more stable, more predictable.
And the sources saw this nervousness reflected in the financial markets, too. More volatility.
This is where it gets quite specific. Your sources noted some interesting market behavior. They called it polarized trading.
Meaning some sectors did well, others didn't.
Sort of like tech stocks, the NASDAQ, seemed strong during parts of this period. But other areas like transportation stocks, mid-cap companies, much more choppy.
Okay.
Energy, some tech and communication services also saw gains, so it's complex, part of broader trends. But trade uncertainty was definitely a factor in the volatility.
What about currencies and bonds? Did the sources pick up anything there?
They did. They mentioned the U.S. dollar being near a 2-year low at one point, and U.S. Treasury yields, the interest rates the government pays on its debt, actually increasing.
Rising yields.
Yeah.
Sometimes that signals nervousness about debt, right?
It can. The sources even mentioned whispers about a potential buyer's strike for long-term U.S. bonds, with investors maybe preferring shorter-term debt instead.
And maybe the biggest point here, a worry about the dollar itself, losing its status as the world's safe haven.
That concern was definitely raised in the material. The idea that in times of crisis, maybe investors wouldn't automatically flock to the U.S. dollar like they used to.
And the sources said foreign investors were particularly worried about this, more than domestic ones.
Yeah, that was a specific detail highlighted. Foreign investors were apparently taking steps to hedge to protect themselves against potential dollar weakness or volatility.
That's telling, isn't it? When international money starts actively betting against currency stability.
It suggests a real, tangible concern about the impact of unpredictable policies on fundamental economic pillars. It goes beyond just a trade spat.
Right. And the sources tie this back to specific impacts on allies.
Yes, concrete examples.
Like threats to the EU's auto sector, especially Germany's, and agriculture, too.
Both flagged as vulnerable if targeted by U.S. tariffs.
And for Canada and Mexico, even after the new USMCA deal was done, the sources say there was still this lingering threat of withdrawal or new restrictions.
Yeah, creating ongoing uncertainty for key industries like autos and energy there.
What about allies in Asia? Japan, South Korea?
Similar pressures. Worries about their tech and auto exports to the U.S., obviously. But also, indirectly, U.S. restrictions on accessing other markets, like China.
So if the U.S. blocked tech sales to China, it could hurt South Korean or Japanese companies that supplied components for those sales.
Exactly. It shows how interconnected everything is. The economic ripple effects described were complex, hitting key sectors and allies in many different ways.
Which brings us right back to that central question we started with, hitting enemies or hitting friends too. The sources seem to offer, well, conflicting takes on this.
They definitely present different sides. One viewpoint argues essentially that these policies were a necessary, if difficult, correction.
The idea being the U.S. had carried too much weight for too long. In trade, defense.
Right. That feeling of, eating humble pie while allies got a free ride.
The NATO spending example fits here, doesn't it?
Perfectly. The sources mention a 2020 NATO report showing the U.S. covering around 70% of military costs historically. The argument is demanding allies pay more worked. Several countries did increase defense budgets.
So, a win from that perspective.
And proponents also point to renegotiated trade deals, like USMCA. They cite things like a CBO report suggesting it could boost U.S. exports in autos and agriculture, maybe help the trade balance.
So this view says, yes, it was tough, maybe messy, but it was about rebalancing things, getting better deals for America, and it achieved some of that.
That's the essence of that argument presented. But then you have the counter-argument focusing heavily on the damage.
The damage to trust, cooperation, and the actual costs imposed on allies.
And the evidence cited there is pretty strong, too. First, just reiterating that using the national security excuse for tariffs on close allies like the EU, Canada, Japan, that was seen as fundamentally unacceptable, a blow to the alliance itself.
And it wasn't just feelings hurt, right? There were economic costs within the U.S. from the retaliation.
Absolutely. The sources bring up the U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimate over $11 billion lost in U.S. agricultural exports between 2018 and 2020 due to retaliatory tariffs.
So hitting American farmers, ironically, one of the groups the policies were supposedly meant to help.
That's the irony highlighted. And beyond tariffs, pulling out of international agreements, Paris, the Iran deal, UN bodies is framed as weakening the global order the U.S. helped build.
And causing allies to really doubt U.S. commitment.
Yeah, there's a foreign affairs analysis mentioned suggesting this unilateral turn could actually create space for rivals, like China, to step up and gain influence internationally.
At a potential long-term strategic cost, trading short-term assertiveness for maybe a loss of global leadership down the road?
That's the risk outlined. And you see the direct result, allies seeking more independence.
The strategic autonomy push in the EU. Macron and France calling for less reliance on U.S. security.
Exactly. And in Asia, South Korea and Japan looking to strengthen regional ties, like through the RCEP trade pact. Basically, allies started hedging their bets, building alternatives.
So, putting it all together from the sources, it's definitely not a simple picture.
No, it's complex. The intent might have been straightforward, protect U.S. interests, pressure rivals, but the methods.
The broad tariffs, pulling out of deals, they often seem to hit friends and foes alike.
That's how the sources portray it. And approach that, in practice, struggle to make that distinction, applying pressure more indiscriminately.
And the fallout, as documented in your sources, was significant. Unease, damaged trust, real economic pain for allies.
And potentially long-lasting consequences for global relationships and how the U.S. is perceived. It goes beyond just one administration or one set of policies.
That really seems to be the core message woven through all this material.
I think so.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Seriously, thank you for sharing these sources and letting us really unpack them.
My pleasure. It's a crucial topic, and the sources certainly provided a lot of food for thought.
Absolutely. And it leaves us and you listening with a pretty big thought to chew on, doesn't it? If policies that put national interest first, above everything else, can strain alliances built over decades and potentially shake up the global economy. What does that mean for the future?
Yeah, does it fundamentally change how countries have to interact?
Does it push us towards a world with maybe less global interdependence, more regional blocs focused inward, almost regardless of who's in charge in any particular country?
It's a profound question about the future shape of international relations and trade, definitely stemming from the dynamics explored in these sources. Something to keep thinking about.